Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1: Between Two Great Waters. Dawn comes gently to the Caribbean coast of Panama. At first, the harbor is a wide field of muted gray. Small, even ripples move across its surface. Low clouds rest above the horizon, and beyond the water, distant hills appear in quiet layers of green. The air is already warm. It carries the faint sense of rain, wet leaves, salt water, and the working harbor near Cologne. A large ship waits offshore, moving almost too slowly to notice. Its engines hold it steady while pale light gathers across the morning sky. Containers rise from the deck in orderly rows, carrying many kinds of goods toward ports far away. For now, all of them travel together, resting aboard one vessel at the edge of a remarkable passage. From the harbor, a pilot boat approaches. It is small beside the waiting ship, and it leaves a narrow white wake across the darker water. A canal pilot will soon come aboard and help guide the vessel through one of the most carefully managed waterways on Earth. Ahead lies the Panama Canal, a passage about 80 kilometers or 50 miles long. It crosses Panama between the Caribbean Sea, which forms part of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. On a map, this distance may seem modest, yet within those 80 kilometers are entrance channels, immense locks, a broad freshwater lake, forested shores, and a narrow passage through the continental divide. The ship will not be able to see one ocean from the other, nor will it travel in a straight line through an open trench at sea level. Instead, it will enter a freshwater pathway that rises into the tropical interior, crosses the high center of the country, and then descends toward the opposite coast. Panama occupies the narrow southern portion of Central America. Its curving land joins the larger regions of North and South America, forming a land bridge between the continents. The country is slender in places, but it is not merely an obstacle between two seas. It is a living landscape of mountains, rivers, wetlands, islands, forests, cities, farms, and communities. Its position has given it an unusual importance for a very long time. From the Atlantic entrance near Cologne, the canal leads inland toward Gatun. There, a ship enters a series of enormous lock chambers. A lock is a water-filled room with gates at either end. When water flows into the chamber, the water level rises. The ship rises with it, gently supported by the same buoyancy that keeps any vessel afloat. The locks lift the ship toward Gatun Lake, roughly 26 meters or 85 feet above sea level. One might imagine an immense staircase made not from stone steps, but from enclosed pools of water. The vessel floats upward from one level to the next. Then the final gate opens, revealing a broad freshwater horizon in the tropical interior. This is one of the canal's defining features. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans do not literally meet or blend at its center. Between them lies Gatun Lake, formed by damming the Chagres River, along with connected channels and excavated passages. Fresh water fills the locks and supports the movement of ships. The canal is therefore more than a route between saltwater coasts. It is a carefully tended inland water system, dependent upon rivers, rainfall, forests, reservoirs, machinery, and human attention. Once raised to the lake, the ship crosses a landscape that can feel unexpectedly spacious. Forested islands and peninsulas line the route. Birds pass over the water. Along the banks, dense vegetation grows in many shades, from the pale green of new leaves to the deeper green of the canopy. The scene may appear quiet and untouched, yet the channel itself has been surveyed, dredged, marked, and monitored with great care. Navigation markers indicate the safe route. Crews watch the movement of vessels. Beneath the calm surface is a system shaped by both the natural landscape and long patient work. Farther on, the route narrows through the continental divide, the elevated spine of land separating waters that naturally drain toward opposite oceans. Here, a vessel moves between steep, managed slopes. It does not hurry. It follows the channel through the interior, guided by pilots, signals, schedules, and the careful coordination of many people. Beyond this narrower passage, the waterway opens again. The ship enters another sequence of locks and begins to descend. Step by step, chamber by chamber, it returns towards sea level. At the Pacific end, near Balboa and Panama City, the final gates open toward the ocean. The ship has crossed a continent, although much of its journey has taken place above the level of either sea. A complete transit, once underway, commonly takes about 8 to 10 hours. The total time spent in canal waters may be longer. Ships may wait for an assigned passage time, a suitable lock chamber, safe conditions, and the orderly movement of other traffic. Water levels, weather, vessel size, congestion, and operating schedules can all affect the pace. Nothing here is quite as simple as drawing a line across a map. Even the two coasts behave differently. At the Caribbean entrance, the tides are comparatively modest. At the Pacific entrance, the water rises and falls across a much greater range. This difference influenced the design of the canal, including decisions about the height and structure of its lock gates. The waterway connects two maritime regions without making them identical. Now, in the growing light, the waiting ship begins to move toward the entrance channel. Navigation markers stand at measured intervals. Tugboats and other vessels pass nearby, each following instructions meant to keep traffic safe and orderly. Along the shore, cranes, warehouses, roads, rail lines, and buildings reveal the many layers of activity surrounding every transit. Much of the work remains almost invisible from the ship's deck. Pilots, tugboat crews, lock operators, engineers, line handlers, schedulers, maintenance workers, dredging crews, weather observers, and many others contribute to the passage. Some watch instruments and displays, some inspect machinery, gates, and concrete. Some handle heavy lines beneath the tropical sun. Others study rainfall and water levels across the surrounding watershed. A ship may seem to move through the canal by itself, gliding quietly over still water. In truth, its journey depends upon many hands, many decisions, and many forms of knowledge. The canal is often described as an engineering achievement, and it is. Yet it is also a long human story, shaped by labor, adaptation, unequal power, ambition, illness, persistence, and care. People from Panama, the Caribbean, Europe, North America, Asia, and elsewhere took part in its construction and operation. Their experiences were not equal. Pay, status, living conditions, and exposure to risk differed sharply. The smooth passage of a modern ship rests upon difficult histories that cannot be seen in the quiet water beside its hull. Those histories will remain with us as the journey continues. They are part of the canal, just as surely as the locks, the lake, and the channel through the hills. Still, the canal's importance cannot be understood through construction alone. Its wider meaning lies in geography and in the way human beings measure distance. Before the canal opened, many ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific sides of the Americas had to sail around Cape Horn, near the southern end of South America. For some routes, that voyage added thousands of miles. Crossing Panama could save weeks at sea, as well as fuel, provisions, and expense. The change brought distant ports into closer practical relationship. Raw materials could travel to factories by different routes. Agricultural goods could reach markets sooner. Naval planners reconsidered how fleets might move between oceans. Port cities gained new opportunities, while older routes adjusted to changing patterns of commerce. Yet the canal does not shorten every voyage in the same way. A vessel's choice depends on where its journey begins and ends, what it carries, how large it is, what tolls must be paid, whether the canal is congested, and what alternatives are available. Geography offers possibilities, not one answer for every ship. For some routes, Panama is the natural crossing. For others, vessels may use the Suez Canal, travel around a continent, connect with railways and ports, or follow other paths shaped by economics and technology. The Panama Canal changed the map of practical distance, but that map has never stopped changing. The waterway also depends on limits that are easy to overlook. Each transit requires coordination. Lock chambers have particular dimensions. Channels must remain deep and clear. Fresh water must be stored and released. Rainfall in the interior matters to ships arriving from distant seas. A dry season, a crowded schedule, or a vessel's size can influence decisions made long before the ship reaches Panama. In this way, the canal joins distant worlds through a deeply local landscape. Global shipping depends on tropical rain. Ocean voyages depend on inland forests and rivers. Steel hulls rise and fall because fresh water moves through carefully controlled chambers. As the ship nears the first locks, sunlight reaches the green hills. The low clouds begin to lift, revealing the folds of the land more clearly. Beyond the concrete walls, fresh water waits to raise the vessel toward the interior. It is easy to picture the canal as a narrow ribbon connecting two broad blue spaces. its true form is more intricate. It is an agreement between landscape and machinery, between rainfall and scheduling, between old rivers and modern gates. Water must be stored, measured, released, and protected. Every passage depends upon stewardship, the patient responsibility of caring for a system so that it can continue to serve those who rely on it. The canal has changed the movement of ships, cargo, people, and ideas. It has influenced the working lives of ports and the imagined distances between nations. It has also created responsibilities that continue from one generation to the next. Connection is never made by engineering alone. It requires attention to water, land, labor, and the communities through which the route passes, and Panama itself remains far more than the setting for this work. The canal crosses a country whose history reaches well beyond the era of concrete, steel, and engines. Long before lock walls rose from the humid landscape, people understood the value of this narrow land. They traveled by river and forest path. They carried goods between communities, exchanged knowledge, and learned the seasons of rain and wind. The modern passage follows a much older human understanding. Here the distance between great waters is narrow enough to invite movement, but rich and varied enough to shape how that movement occurs. As the first lock gate prepares to open, the harbor seems to grow still. The ship waits upon the Caribbean water. Ahead, the chambers rise toward a freshwater lake hidden among green hills. For a moment, the modern scene softens into an older view. There are green banks beneath morning clouds, rivers winding among trees, and paths leading quietly across the land. Before there was a canal, there was already a crossing place. Chapter 2. Before the Canal. Before there was a canal, there was already a crossing place. For thousands of years before European ships appeared, people lived among Panama's forests, rivers, mountains, islands, and coastal plains. They knew where fresh water could be found in a dry season, when trees would bear fruit, and which channels were deep enough for a canoe. They understood fish and animals, stone and clay, and the paths by which one community could reach another. A modern map can make Panama look mainly like a slender corridor between continents. Archaeology offers a richer picture. Ancient Panama was not empty ground through which people hurried elsewhere, but a homeland where diverse communities developed their own customs over generations. Hunters moved through woodland and open country. Farmers cultivated useful plants in soils shaped by tropical rain. Fishers worked along shores, estuaries, and rivers. Chapter 3. The Dream of a Shortcut. Far to the south of Panama, a sailing ship moved along the outer edge of South America. Its canvas rose pale against a gray sky, while cold water lifted and lowered the hull in long, deliberate swells. Somewhere beyond the mist lay Cape Horn, the rocky headland near the southern end of the continent. For ships passing between the Atlantic and Pacific, this was one of the great turning places of the world. The passage was not equally dangerous on every voyage. There were days when the wind eased and the sea offered a manageable road. Yet Cape Horn was rightly regarded as formidable. Strong winds could sweep across open water with little land to restrain them. Large seas rolled through the region, while cold weather, fog, and changing conditions demanded constant attention. A captain might wait for a favorable moment, shorten sail, or alter course. Crews worked in wet clothes and cold air as the ship continued around the southern boundary of the Americas. Another route passed through the Strait of Magellan, the winding channel between the mainland and the islands to its south. It avoided the open waters around the Horn, but brought difficulties of its own. Narrow passages, uncertain winds, strong currents, and complicated navigation all required care. Either way, a journey from one side of the Americas to the other could become a voyage of many thousands of miles. On a quiet evening at sea, a navigator might spread a chart beneath the light of an oil lamp. The paper showed an enormous curve southward, around the continent, and then north again. With a pair of dividers, an instrument with two pointed legs, the navigator could measure the route in small steps. Each step represented more water to cross, more days, more food for the crew, more strain upon ropes, sails, engines, and hull. Then the navigator's hand might move toward the narrow waist of Central America. There, Atlantic and Pacific waters drew remarkably close. The distance on the chart seemed modest beside the long sweep around South America. Ever since Spain had established colonial rule in the region, proposals had appeared for an artificial passage across this land. Some imagined a channel for boats, others suggested linking navigable rivers or improving existing overland routes. The thought returned in different forms across many generations. If nature had brought the oceans so close together, perhaps people could complete the passage. For a long time, however, the idea remained beyond practical reach. The land was not an empty strip awaiting a simple trench. Central America contained forested mountains, broad lakes, winding rivers, low swamps, and places where rain fell with remarkable abundance. Digging technology was limited, transport was slow, and the cost would have exceeded what many governments or merchants could sustain. Political conditions and colonial rivalries added further uncertainty. A canal required more than a possible route. It required stable agreements, immense financing, careful management, and years of coordinated labor. And so the ships continued south. During the 19th century, the old idea gained new importance. Global commerce expanded, industrial production increased, and ports became connected through denser networks of trade. Sailing ships still crossed the oceans, but steamships became more common. Their engines gave them some independence from the wind and allowed vessels to follow schedules with greater regularity. Yet steam power created a new need. It required fuel. Coal had to be carried aboard or obtained at stations along the route. Every additional day at sea meant more coal consumed, more wages paid, and more provisions used. A longer voyage also brought greater wear upon a ship and could increase the cost of insurance. To merchants, ship owners, and governments, distance could now be counted not only in miles, but also in time and money. A passage through Central America promised substantial savings on certain journeys. A voyage between the east and west coasts of the United States, for example, could be shortened by roughly 8,000 nautical miles, compared with rounding Cape Horn. For some routes between Ecuador and Europe, the saving might be around 5,000 miles. These figures were illustrations, not universal measures. The precise distance depended on the ports, the route, and the vessel. The world's oceans could not be reduced to a single shortcut. Some ships would still find other routes more suitable. Depending on their origin and destination, vessels might use the Strait of Magellan or the Suez Canal. Cargo could also travel overland by railway and later through intermodal systems combining ships, trains, and trucks. Even a converted canal across Central America would serve some journeys far better than others. Still, the possibility was compelling. In offices near busy harbors, commercial planners bent over maps beneath steady lamplight. Lines were drawn between ports. Distances were measured, erased, and measured once more. A shorter passage promised savings in coal, wages, insurance, and wear on the ships themselves. Naval officers studied the same narrow region for different reasons. A canal might allow warships to move between oceans without making the long southern voyage. For nations seeking wider influence, the proposed waterway offered strategic power as well as commercial convenience. Trade, geography, and national ambition became closely intertwined. Yet even among those who favored a canal, there was no agreement about where it should be built. The eventual choice of Panama may seem natural when viewed from the present, but it was never inevitable. Throughout the 19th century, planners considered several possible routes across Central America. Two received particular attention. One crossed Nicaragua, the other crossed Panama. Nicaragua appeared to offer the assistance of nature. Lake Nicaragua, a large body of fresh water, occupied part of the distance between the oceans. To the east, the San Juan River flowed toward the Caribbean Sea. On a map, the river and lake seemed to form much of a ready-made waterway. Engineers imagined ships traveling along the river, crossing the broad lake, and then entering a constructed channel leading toward the Pacific. But maps could make difficult landscapes look deceptively simple. Rivers changed with the seasons. Channels might be shallow, winding, or interrupted by rapids. Harbors also required careful study. A route that used a lake and river could reduce excavation in one place while creating complicated work elsewhere. Even so, Nicaragua remained a serious contender. It had influential advocates and was examined in repeated surveys. Panama offered a different balance of advantages and obstacles. Its crossing was shorter. Existing paths and river routes had already demonstrated its value as a connection between the oceans. Ports on either side could serve growing networks of shipping, but the land rose across the interior, and any canal would require difficult excavation. The Chagres River, useful for transport, yet powerful during the rainy season, would have to be controlled or incorporated into the design. Panama was also very wet. Rain could soften exposed earth, swell streams, and interrupt work. To understand these possibilities, surveyors entered the landscape. They carried compasses, measuring chains, notebooks, levels, and delicate instruments mounted on tripods. A survey was the patient work of discovering the true shape of the ground. Surveyors measured heights and distances, recorded the direction of rivers, examined soil and rock, and searched for possible lines of passage. Their observations slowly turned broad hopes into profiles, figures, and competing engineering plans. In a rain-soaked camp, sheets of paper might be protected beneath canvas, while water tapped steadily overhead. Boots rested near wooden crates. Damp instruments were carefully wiped clean. Beyond the shelter, the forest held countless shades of green, and a nearby stream sounded fuller than it had the day before. By lamplight, a surveyor transferred field measurements into a notebook. A ridge that seemed low from a distance proved higher when measured. A river bend added length to one route. A valley offered a gentler approach, though perhaps through softer ground. Every detail mattered. A canal could not be built across the simple flat colors of a political map. It had to pass through actual stone, clay, water, and forest. The surveys also raised a fundamental question. Should a canal be dug at sea level, allowing ships to sail directly from one ocean to the other? Or should locks lift vessels above sea level and lower them again? A lock is a chamber with a gate at each end. By admitting or releasing water, the chamber can raise or lower a ship between different elevations. Locks might reduce the amount of deep excavation required, but they would need dams, reservoirs, dependable water supplies, and carefully designed machinery. A sea-level canal seemed simpler in operation, yet cutting one through high ground could require the removal of an extraordinary quantity of earth. Each proposal led to further calculations. How much ground would have to be excavated? How long might construction take? What would happen during heavy rain? How many ships could pass? How much would the canal cost, and who would pay for it? These were engineering questions, but their answers were never determined by engineering alone. Companies sought investors. Governments negotiated rights. Newspapers promoted one route and criticized another. Representatives of different nations considered how a canal might alter trade, naval planning, and political influence. Nicaragua's natural waterways attracted powerful supporters. Panama's shorter crossing appealed to others. Money shaped which surveys continued. Diplomacy shaped who could make agreements. Commercial rivalry and national power shaped which arguments received the greatest attention. Geography offered possibilities, but politics helped decide which possibility might advance. Meanwhile, ships continued along the southern routes. Steam rose from funnels and drifted behind them in dark ribbons. Coal disappeared steadily into furnaces. On sailing vessels, crews adjusted canvas to meet the wind. Cargoes of grain, machinery, cloth, metals, fruit, and countless other goods moved slowly between distant ports. The imagined canal was still absent from the landscape. No unbroken water road crossed Central America. There were only measurements, estimates, debates, and maps, laid open beneath lamps. Yet, something important had changed. The passage was no longer merely an old colonial proposal or a wish traced casually across a chart. Surveyors had walked through valleys and climbed over ridges. Engineers had begun to compare practical designs. Merchants had calculated potential savings, while governments considered the reach that a canal might give them. The dream had acquired dimensions. Across the isthmus, thin pencil marks now joined one coast to the other. They crossed rivers on paper, passed through shaded hills, and continued toward a second ocean. Some lines would be abandoned, others would be revised until little remained of their original form. Before any canal could carry a ship, another kind of industrial crossing would appear. In the quiet light over the maps, the pencil lines began to resemble rails of steel. Soon those rails would extend slowly through rain and forest, joining the shores by land before water found its way between them. Chapter 4. Rails Through the Rain. Before a channel could carry ships across Panama, a narrower path began to take shape between the oceans. It was formed not of water, but of timber, gravel, iron, and steel. Along this path, Locomotives would pull passengers and freight through the tropical landscape. Their wheels would click across bridges, while their whistles traveled beyond the tracks and faded among the trees. The need for such a crossing grew swiftly in the middle of the 19th century. The California Gold Rush drew large numbers of travelers toward the Pacific coast of North America. For people beginning their journeys in the eastern United States, the distance was immense. They could make a difficult journey across the continent, or they could travel by sea around Cape Horn at the southern end of South America. The voyage around the Cape covered a vast curve of ocean. It took travelers far south, before carrying them north again along the Pacific coast. Panama offered another possibility. A traveler could sail to the Caribbean side of the isthmus, cross the narrow land, and board another vessel on the Pacific shore. This route did not remove every hardship. Passengers still faced long sea passages, transfers at both ends, uncertain schedules, and the careful movement of trunks, parcels, and cargo from one form of transport to another. Yet the route avoided the long voyage around South America. As more people traveled toward California, the value of a quicker and more dependable crossing became increasingly clear. The Panama Railroad was begun in 1850. Its planned route extended roughly 47 miles, or 76 kilometers, between the Caribbean and Pacific sides of Panama. On a map, the distance appeared modest. A thin line could be drawn across the narrow isthmus in only a moment. The land itself was more complicated. Those 47 miles passed through a region shaped by abundant water, dense vegetation, rivers, mud, heat, and intense rain. Rain filled streams and gathered in low ground. It softened the earth beneath the proposed track and turned exposed soil into mud. Swampy stretches interrupted the route. Rivers crossed it. Vegetation grew thickly in the warmth and returned quickly to places that had been cleared. Wooden structures exposed to constant damp could weaken and decay. Even the arrival of supplies presented a problem. Rails, tools, machinery, food, clothing, and replacement materials had to come by ship. Once unloaded, they had to be carried toward work sites along a route that was not yet complete. At times, the rain fell so steadily that it seemed to join sky and ground. It ticked against temporary roofs, slipped from broad leaves, and gathered around stacked tools and wooden ties. Workers placed earth and stone into wet ground, only to find that some sections settled under the weight. Bridges were required where rivers crossed the surveyed line. Embankments had to be raised, drainage channels had to be opened. Structures needed repair as moisture worked quietly into wood and soil. Progress came gradually, rail by rail. Laborers cleared vegetation, moved earth, carried materials, drove supports, laid wooden ties, and fastened rails in heat and rain. The work was demanding, and labor turnover remained high. Some workers stayed only briefly before leaving. Others became ill or were unable to continue. As people departed, new laborers had to be found, brought to the isthmus, housed, supplied, and organized. Disease was among the gravest difficulties. Yellow fever and malaria affected workers along the route, though the role of mosquitoes in carrying those illnesses was not yet understood. Without that knowledge, people could not protect themselves effectively. The wet environment and standing water allowed mosquito populations to thrive, while the demands of construction continued day after day. Many people died during the building of the railroad, but the exact number is not known. Records were incomplete. Laborers often arrived and departed without consistent documentation, and deaths were not always recorded in a reliable way. Later estimates have varied greatly, so no sensational total can be repeated with confidence. What can be said is quieter, and no less important. The human cost was severe. Much of that cost was borne by laborers whose names were not preserved in official accounts. Their effort remained in the raised ground, the bridges, the wooden ties, and the iron rails beneath the passing wheels. Supply problems continued throughout construction. Until enough track had been laid, materials had to move slowly through difficult terrain. Once a section became usable, trains could carry rails, ties, tools, and other supplies farther inland. The railway began to assist in its own creation. A locomotive could move to the edge of the finished line, bringing what was needed for the next section. Ahead of it, workers cleared and shaped the ground. Behind it, The completed track remained surrounded by water, heat, and returning vegetation. Rain continued to fall. Mud gathered beneath boots and wheels. Rivers rose and receded. Wooden structures required attention. Plants leaned toward open spaces and sent roots into disturbed soil. The railroad was never simply placed upon the land and forgotten. From its earliest days, it required inspection, drainage, repair, and renewal. In 1855, 5 years after construction began, the tracks were completed across the isthmus. For the first time, travelers could move by rail from one ocean coast to the other. The crossing that had once depended upon a more difficult combination of river travel, trails, and overland transport could now be made by train. The Panama Railroad has sometimes been described as the first transcontinental railroad. That phrase needs a little care. The railway crossed the narrow American isthmus from one ocean coast to another. It did not cross the full width of a continent in the later North American sense. Its achievement was different in scale, though still remarkable. It joined the Caribbean and Pacific shores by rail at one of the narrowest places between them. At one terminus, passengers arrived after a long voyage at sea. They stepped ashore with trunks, bundles, and expectations of the ocean beyond the land. Their belongings were transferred from ship to railway, then they entered the carriages, and the locomotive drew them inland. The wheels settled into a measured rhythm. They clicked across bridges and passed through low, wet country. Warm air entered through open windows, carrying the scent of damp soil and vegetation. Rain drummed on the carriage roof, sometimes lightly, and sometimes with a steadier weight. At stopping places, workers checked the train, handled baggage and freight, and prepared the line for the journey ahead. Then the locomotive continued toward the opposite shore. The railway crossing remained only one part of a much longer journey. At the far end, passengers still had to leave the train, transfer their belongings again, and board another vessel. They might wait for a ship to depart. Weather and schedules could still bring delays. Cargo had to be unloaded, carried, sorted, and loaded once more. The railroad did not make travel effortless. It did, however, make the Panama route more practical and predictable. Travelers no longer had to sail all the way around Cape Horn. Goods could cross the isthmus more reliably. The route became profitable, and every passing train demonstrated the commercial value of connecting the two coasts. The railway offered practical proof of something that maps, surveys, and proposals had only suggested. People and businesses were willing to pay for a shorter connection between the oceans. Yet, the railroad taught another lesson as well. Crossing Panama required more than laying down a line and declaring the work complete. Water had to be guided away from foundations. Bridges had to endure rivers swollen by rain. Equipment needed protection from moisture. Workers required food, housing, medical attention, and dependable supplies. Vegetation had to be cleared again and again. Every mile added to the line brought new knowledge about transport and logistics. It showed how people, machinery, food, fuel, and construction materials might be moved through the isthmus. It also revealed the working conditions that any larger project would face. Tropical water did not merely fall and flow away. It remained in the soil, gathered beside structures, weakened wood, fed vegetation, and changed the ground beneath the rails. These lessons would later matter greatly. When canal construction began on a much larger scale, the railroad became an essential working tool. Trains carried laborers and machinery. They moved food, concrete materials, fuel, spare parts, and other supplies to construction sites. They also carried excavated earth and rock, away from the great cuts being made through the hills. The railway helped organize the enormous movement required by canal building. A train could bring workers and equipment to one place, then return carrying spoil from the excavations. Tracks could connect work areas with storage grounds, docks, workshops, and settlements. The old crossing between the seas became part of the machinery that would transform the isthmus once again. Even then, the route could not remain unchanged. During the American canal building period, the creation of Gatun Lake flooded portions of the original railway. Sections of track had to be rebuilt and relocated onto higher ground. Surveyors once more studied the landscape. Workers raised new embankments, prepared foundations, and laid rails beside waters that were slowly changing the form of the land. The railway adapted as the canal emerged around it. In this way, the Panama Railroad became several things at once. It was a technological achievement across difficult terrain. It was a profitable transportation route that showed the commercial value of crossing Panama. It was a store of practical knowledge about supplies, working conditions, drainage, maintenance, and the persistent effects of tropical water and vegetation. It was also a project created through dangerous labor, much of it poorly documented. Its usefulness cannot be separated from the hardship of those who built it. The steady line of steel rested upon years of effort, illness, uncertainty, and loss. Still, the trains continued to pass. In the evening, a locomotive moved beneath a pale sky, its carriages following through drifting mist. Rain ticked softly on the roofs. Passengers watched the forest slide by, while cargo rested in the cars behind them. The rails shone briefly in the fading light, extending toward one sea and then the other. The railway had become an enduring line across the isthmus, useful yet fragile, always surrounded by water, mud, heat, and returning green. It waited there, ready to serve a project larger than itself. Beyond the bridges and the stations, another dream was gathering strength. It was no longer merely a road over which passengers and cargo might pass. It was a channel wide enough for the ships themselves. Chapter 5: The French Attempt. The railway had shown that people and cargo could cross Panama in a matter of hours, traveling from one ocean to the other beneath the deep green shade of the tropical forest. Yet every traveler still had to leave one vessel and board another. Every crate had to be unloaded, carried over the isthmus, and placed aboard a waiting ship on the opposite shore. The larger dream remained. There might one day be a continuous channel through which the ships themselves could pass. In the late 19th century, few people seemed better prepared to pursue that dream than Ferdinand de Lesseps. A French diplomat and promoter, de Lesseps had become internationally famous through the successful construction of the Suez Canal, which opened in Egypt in 1869. That waterway crossed low, dry country and linked the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. Ships passed through at sea level, without locks and without being lifted over high ground. The success at Suez gave de Lesseps immense confidence. It inspired confidence in others as well. If a canal could join two seas in Egypt, many believed that another could join the Atlantic and Pacific in Panama. Investors bought shares in the new enterprise. Families placed their savings in it. Newspapers described a modern work of engineering that would shorten the great sea routes of the world. French excavation began in Panama in 1881. Surveyors, engineers, mechanics, clerks, physicians, cooks, railway crews, and laborers arrived on the isthmus. Heavy equipment crossed the Atlantic in pieces and was assembled near the route. Steam excavators stood beside muddy cuttings. Small locomotives pulled cars filled with rock and glistening red-brown earth. Workshops, storehouses, hospitals, offices, and settlements appeared along the proposed line of the canal. But Panama was not Suez. The difference could be felt first in the rain. The dry landscape around Suez had presented its own difficulties, including drifting sand. Panama, by contrast, received heavy tropical downpours. Rain drummed upon roofs, leaves, railway cars, and excavation walls. It gathered in shallow hollows, filled wheel ruts, and ran in narrow streams down newly exposed slopes. Soil that had seemed firm could become saturated. A modest waterway in the morning might deepen and spread beneath an afternoon sky. At the center of the isthmus lay the continental divide, the elevated ground separating rivers that flowed toward different oceans. A canal at sea level would have to pass through this higher country. The deepest cutting was needed near Culebra, where hills rose along the proposed route. Passing through them required far more than digging the long trench across a level plain. The geology was complex. Layers of clay, weathered rock, and harder stone rested together in ways that were not always visible from the surface. When workers cut into the hillsides, they changed the balance of the slopes. Rain entered the exposed material, adding weight and reducing stability. Earth that had taken days or weeks to remove could slide back into the cutting, sometimes carrying track and equipment with it. The landscape was not an enemy, nor was it resisting the work in any human sense. Rain continued to fall, water followed gravity. Saturated soil shifted and settled. Rivers rose and declined with the seasons. These were ordinary processes within a living tropical region, but the original plans had not fully accounted for their effects on such a vast excavation. The Chagres River presented another challenge. It crossed the proposed canal route and changed greatly with the weather. During a drier period, it might appear manageable. After sustained rain across its broad watershed, it could swell with considerable force, carrying branches, sediment, and large volumes of water toward the works. Temporary barriers and channels were vulnerable to flooding. Excavations filled with water. Machinery stood in muddy pools, and carefully prepared areas had to be cleared once more. De Lesseps continued to favor a sea-level canal, modeled conceptually upon Suez. Lock seemed to him less elegant, and perhaps less permanent, than a channel through which vessels could sail without being raised or lowered. Yet as excavation continued, it became increasingly clear that Panama called for a different design. The high ground, the changing Chagres, the rainfall, and the unstable slopes were not minor complications. Together, they shaped the entire undertaking. Behind the plans, public speeches, and machinery stood a much larger human story. A great share of the labor force came from the Caribbean, especially from islands where workers were recruited with promises of wages. They cleared vegetation, carried supplies, maintained railway lines, loaded excavation cars, repaired machinery, and performed much of the daily physical labor upon which the project depended. Other workers came from Europe, Asia, and various parts of the Americas. Their experiences were not all the same, but many endured poor housing, uncertain sanitation, exhausting work, and limited medical care. Injuries occurred around locomotives, explosives, excavators, and shifting ground. Other diseases spread through crowded settlements. Most devastating of all were yellow fever and malaria. At that time, mosquito-borne disease was not yet properly understood. Many explanations were proposed for recurring illness. Some people blamed damp air, decaying vegetation, or poisonous vapors thought to rise from wet soil. Because the actual means of transmission remained uncertain, even sincere precautions often failed. Water stood in barrels, cisterns, puddles, and uncovered containers. These places provided breeding grounds for mosquitoes, though their importance had not yet been recognized. The insects moved quietly through settlements and work camps, nearly unnoticed among the larger sights and sounds of excavation. Yellow fever could appear quickly, particularly among people newly arrived in the region. Malaria weakened many others through recurring fever. Hospitals treated great numbers of patients, but medical workers did not yet possess the knowledge needed to interrupt transmission. New employees continued to arrive, bringing more susceptible people into places where disease was already common. The exact number of deaths during the French era remains uncertain because documentation was incomplete. Estimates commonly place the toll at around 20,000 people or more. No total can fully represent so many separate lives. Many of those who died were not French citizens, and the losses among Caribbean workers were especially severe. Some names were entered into company papers, hospital records, church registers, or family letters. Others were recorded imperfectly, or not at all. Those who came to Panama were workers, but they were also parents and children, partners and friends, neighbors and companions. They carried languages, practical skills, memories, songs, recipes, and hopes across the sea. A history centered only upon famous planners would leave most of the canal's human story unseen. The unfinished channel was shaped by thousands of hands, including many whose names did not remain in the surviving accounts. As the years passed, costs climbed far beyond the early expectations. Landslides repeatedly increased the volume of material that had to be removed. Flooding interrupted construction. Machinery deteriorated in the heat and moisture. Disease disrupted crews and created a constant need for replacements. Above all, the sea-level design required excavation on a scale that the available organization and finances could not sustain. Meanwhile, public statements in France often remained more optimistic than conditions justified. Investors were encouraged to believe that completion was nearer and more certain than it truly was. Mismanagement weakened the enterprise, while corruption became part of the effort to obtain further financial support. Enormous expenses continued, and public confidence gradually faded. In 1889, the original French Canal Company collapsed. Its failure caused deep financial losses in France. where many small investors had trusted the reputation of de Lesseps and the memory of Suez. Investigations followed, revealing misleading claims and improper dealings. Yet no single explanation could account for the collapse. Disease had taken a terrible toll, but disease alone did not end the project. Engineering decisions, complex geology, heavy rainfall, inadequate control of the Chagres, financial disorder, mismanagement, corruption, unrealistic promises, and the enormous cost of the undertaking all played a part. The canal remained incomplete, but the French effort had not produced nothing. Crews had removed a substantial quantity of earth and rock. They had constructed workshops, hospitals, offices, railway connections, and settlements. Engineers had surveyed the route, measured rainfall and river flow, studied the hills, and learned where the ground was most likely to move. Each season of work added to a growing body of knowledge about the isthmus. A successor French company continued on a more limited scale. It could not complete the canal, but it preserved property and equipment while carrying out valuable technical studies. By the late 1890s, French engineers had developed proposals for a lock canal. Instead of cutting the entire route down to sea level, such a system would raise ships toward an artificial lake and then lower them on the opposite side. These proposals had important similarities to the canal that would eventually be built. Understanding had changed gradually. Suez had provided a powerful example, but its design could not simply be transferred to another landscape. Panama had to be observed on its own terms. Its rivers, rainfall, elevations, clay, and rock had to become part of the design, rather than being treated as temporary inconveniences that could be removed through greater effort alone. Years later, the United States purchased the French canal assets and rights for $40 million. The purchase included far more than an unfinished trench. It included machinery, buildings, railway equipment, maps, surveys, excavated ground, and accumulated engineering knowledge. Some machines were no longer useful, and some structures had deteriorated in the humid air, but the information left behind would guide those who followed. After the original company collapsed, many work areas grew quiet. Steam shovels rested beside the cuttings. Metal slowly darkened in the moisture. Ferns opened around abandoned equipment, while vines found posts, wheels, and walls upon which to climb. Rain filled the wheel ruts and softened the edges of embankments. The Chagres continued through its basin, rising through the wet months and settling again when the rain diminished. The French attempt had ended without opening a passage between the seas. Its ambitions had exceeded its plans, and its failures had carried an immense human cost. Yet the excavations, surveys, machinery, infrastructure, and later lock proposals remained. They held practical lessons for another generation, along with the memory of those whose labor had made that knowledge possible. And amid the hardship, careful observers had begun to understand one of the most important problems of all. As rain settled into the tracks and vines returned around the unfinished works, attention slowly shifted away from damp soil and evening mist. It turned instead toward the small insects moving almost unnoticed through the warm evening air. Chapter 6. Understanding the Invisible Enemy. In the quiet work areas left behind by the French Canal Company, rainwater collected wherever the ground allowed it. It gathered in discarded cans, open barrels, roof gutters, wagon tracks, and shallow hollows pressed into the earth. Around settlements, water stood beside houses and workshops. Along the unfinished excavations, fresh pools formed after each tropical shower. The landscape itself was not an enemy. Panama's forests, rivers, insects, and seasons belonged to an intricate living world that had existed long before anyone imagined a canal. Yet construction and settlement had altered parts of that world. Thousands of people had arrived. Forest had been cleared, soil disturbed, and water stored near crowded dwellings. Ditches, containers, and excavations created new places where mosquitoes could breed close to human beings. For much of the 19th century, the connection between mosquitoes and disease remained poorly understood. People often blamed unhealthy air, tropical heat, damp ground, or unpleasant smells. The word malaria itself came from words meaning bad air. Yet air alone could not explain why one person became ill while another remained well, or why certain diseases followed patterns of water, season, and settlement. The answer moved almost unnoticed through the evening, carried on narrow wings. Yellow fever and malaria were often spoken of together because both caused so much illness in tropical regions. But they were, and remain, distinct diseases. Yellow fever is caused by a virus. In towns and cities it is transmitted principally by the mosquito Aedes aegypti. Malaria is caused not by a virus but by parasites. These tiny organisms live for part of their life cycle in human beings and for another part in mosquitoes. They are transmitted by infected mosquitoes of the genus Anopheles. The mosquitoes involved had different habits. Aedes aegypti commonly lived close to people and bred in small containers of water around homes and settlements. Some malaria-carrying Anopheles mosquitoes could breed across broader areas including pools, marshy ground, stream edges, and other bodies of water. These differences would matter greatly when sanitation workers began trying to interrupt transmission. One of the first people to describe the yellow fever connection clearly was the Cuban physician Carlos Finlay. During the 19th century, Finlay studied the repeated outbreaks that visited Havana. He proposed that a mosquito carried yellow fever from an infected person to another person. His idea was not immediately accepted. It challenged familiar explanations, and the evidence available at first did not persuade everyone. Around 1900 and 1901, work associated with the United States Army Yellow Fever Commission in Cuba provided influential confirmation of mosquito transmission. The commission's findings built upon Finlay's insight. Together, this growing body of knowledge helped establish that controlling the right mosquitoes could control the disease. The research involved human participants. Some took part in the belief that the knowledge might save many lives, and some died as a result of their participation. The arrangements included forms of consent that were unusual for the period, but the experiments took place under ethical standards that would not meet modern expectations. To remember the scientific achievement honestly is also to remember the people who bore its risks. At about the same time, understanding of malaria was changing as well. In the 1890s, the physician Ronald Ross demonstrated the role of mosquitoes in transmitting malaria parasites. His work belonged to a wider field of investigation conducted by researchers in several countries, building upon earlier observations of the parasites found in human blood. Gradually, a practical picture emerged. Disease did not simply rise from humid earth. A chain of transmission connected pathogens, mosquitoes, human bodies, water, housing, and patterns of settlement. If enough links in that chain could be broken, illness might decline. William C. Gorgas had already applied mosquito control measures during sanitation work in Havana. In 1904, he became Chief Sanitation Officer for the American Canal Project. He arrived with experience and with a clearer scientific foundation than earlier canal builders had possessed. Yet Gorgas did not act alone. The sanitation of the canal zone was not the work of a single celebrated official. It depended upon accumulated knowledge from Cuba, Europe, the Americas, and other regions where mosquito-borne illness had been studied. It also depended upon nurses, physicians, hospital attendants, engineers, inspectors, record keepers, carpenters, fumigation teams, and large crews of laborers who carried out repetitive tasks in rain and heat. Their work often appeared very ordinary. One worker turned over a bucket so that it could not hold rain. Another fitted a cover over a water barrel. Drainage crews opened narrow channels through wet ground, allowing pools to empty. Vegetation was cleared near some settlements, and ditches were repaired so that water would continue to flow rather than settle. Where standing water could not be drained, crews sometimes spread a thin layer of oil or applied larvicides to kill the immature mosquitoes living in the water. Inspectors moved from house to house, looking beneath steps, beside kitchens, and behind sheds. They examined cisterns, gutters, jars, cans, barrels, and roof drains. They marked locations in record books, then returned to see whether the necessary work had been completed. Maps slowly filled with small notes showing cases of illness and places where mosquitoes had been found. Screens were fitted across windows and doors. Screened verandas allowed moving air to enter, while reducing the passage of insects. During yellow fever outbreaks, buildings were fumigated to kill adult mosquitoes that might have fed on an infected patient. People with the disease were isolated and treated behind protective netting so that mosquitoes could not bite them and carry the virus onward. Water systems were improved. Sewage was carried away more carefully. Streets and settlement areas were drained. Hospitals maintained records that allowed officials to trace changes over time. Inspectors tracked both cases of disease and the habitats in which mosquitoes were breeding. None of these actions seemed especially grand when viewed by itself. Their strength came through patience and repetition. Draining, covering, clearing, screening, inspecting, treating, recording, and then returning to begin the cycle again. Yellow fever transmission was brought under control relatively quickly in the canal zone, because its principal urban mosquito often bred close to homes in containers that could be emptied, covered, or treated. A concentrated program could interrupt its life cycle. The achievement transformed daily life in canal settlements and removed one of the most feared obstacles to construction. Malaria proved more difficult. Its mosquito carriers could breed across broader areas than the household containers and nearby spaces favored by Aedes aegypti. Panama's rains continually renewed pools and wet ground, while the long construction corridor made complete control impossible. Malaria declined greatly under the sanitation program, but it was never eradicated. Workers continued to become ill, and some continued to die. Nor did sanitation make canal construction entirely safe. Landslides still moved through excavated slopes. Accidents involving railways and machinery still occurred. Heat exhausted workers. Pneumonia and other illnesses took lives. The mosquito control program reduced important dangers, but it could not remove every hazard from an immense industrial project. The benefits of sanitation were also distributed unevenly. The canal zone was administered through an unequal colonial system in which authority and resources were not shared fairly. Workers were separated according to race, nationality, occupation, and pay category. Those with higher status were more likely to receive well-built housing, dependable water service, screened rooms, and other protections. Many laborers lived in more crowded quarters with fewer services and fewer barriers against mosquitoes. Sanitation inspections could also be intrusive. Officials entered living spaces, enforced regulations, and decided how communities should be organized. Public health measures that served a genuine purpose could still be carried out through coercive authority. The people asked to comply did not always have an equal voice in the rules, even when they bore much of the labor and risk. The sanitation workforce itself reflected these inequalities. The daily work of clearing vegetation, repairing drains, carrying supplies, treating water, tending patients, and inspecting settlements depended on many people whose names were rarely preserved in public accounts. Their repeated efforts made the program effective. Scientific understanding provided direction, but practical success came through thousands of careful actions performed day after day. These truths can rest beside one another. Organized mosquito control saved lives and demonstrated the remarkable power of public health. It showed that close observation, reliable records, improved infrastructure, and sustained community measures could transform patterns of disease. At the same time, segregation, unequal housing, coercion, and unequal access to services shaped who received protection, who performed the hardest work, and under what conditions that work was done. The lesson was not that tropical nature had been conquered. Mosquitoes remained part of the environment, and rain continued to fall across forest, river, settlement, and excavation. Rather, people had begun to understand how altered human environments affected the movement of disease. Stored water, crowded housing, poor drainage, and inadequate sewage systems had helped create conditions in which transmission could flourish. Changing those conditions could save lives. By late afternoon, the sanitation crews were finishing another round. Water slipped through newly cleared ditches and moved away from houses. Covered barrels stood beside kitchens. A carpenter checked the edge of a window screen, making certain that the fine mesh met the frame. In a hospital, a nurse examined the netting around a patient's bed. Nearby, an inspector closed a record book filled with dates, locations, and small, careful entries. Evening settled gently over the settlements. Lamps began to glow behind screened windows, their light softened by the mesh. Beyond the houses, insects moved through the warm air, while the rainwater followed channels opened by human hands. With yellow fever brought under control and malaria greatly reduced, the canal project could proceed with greater steadiness. But it would move forward under a new political arrangement, one that placed the waterway, the surrounding zone, and much of Panama's future within an unequal relationship that would shape generations to come. Chapter 7: Panama, Power, and a New Beginning. The screened lamps, drained ditches, and carefully kept health records of the canal settlements belonged to a project already shaped by politics. Before sanitation crews could make the region safer, and before engineers could begin their largest works, Agreements had been considered at polished desks, far from the tropical forest. To understand those agreements, it is necessary to return to 1903, when telegrams traveled more quickly than ships, treaty papers passed between government offices, and the future of the isthmus rested uneasily among several nations. At that time, Panama was not an independent republic. It was a province of Colombia, joined to that country through a long and sometimes difficult history. Yet Panamanians were not simply waiting for outsiders to determine their future. Separatist movements had appeared on the isthmus before 1903. They were encouraged by regional grievances, periods of political instability, and a belief among some residents that distant authorities did not always understand Panama's needs. Views within Panama varied. Some people favored independence, some hoped that a canal would bring employment, trade, roads, and greater prosperity. Others worried about foreign influence and the loss of authority over Panamanian land. Many people held several hopes and concerns at once. The isthmus was a place of local ambitions and internal political currents, as well as international plans. For the United States, the desire for a canal had become increasingly practical. American officials wanted a reliable passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, both for commercial shipping and for naval vessels. Panama offered the abandoned French works, an existing railroad, and years of earlier surveys. But because Panama remained a province of Colombia, the United States first had to negotiate with the Colombian government. Those negotiations produced the Hay-Huron Treaty, named for the American Secretary of State John Hay and the Colombian diplomat Tomás Huron. Under its proposed terms, the United States would receive broad rights to construct and operate a canal across Panama. Colombia would receive a payment, followed later by annual compensation. Beneath the steady light of government offices, the paragraphs addressed territory, money, authority, and time. Each carefully written phrase carried consequences for the land and for the people who lived upon it. In Colombia, the treaty met strong opposition. The Colombian Senate rejected it in 1903. That decision arose from several concerns, rather than from one simple disagreement. Senators debated national sovereignty and questioned whether the proposed payment was sufficient. Domestic politics influenced the discussion. So did concern over the French canal concessions and the value that remained in them. Some Colombian leaders believed their country should receive more from any transfer of the French company's rights and property. To many, the treaty appeared to surrender too much control over a valuable part of Colombian territory. The rejection frustrated officials in Washington and alarmed canal supporters in Panama. It also encouraged Panamanian separatists, who feared that the opportunity for a canal might disappear if a new agreement could not be reached. During the final days of October and the opening days of November, messages moved along telegraph wires between Panama, the United States, and those promoting the canal. Meetings were held in houses and offices near the harbor. Plans were discussed quietly. The independence movement grew from genuine currents within Panama, but American diplomatic and military support would be decisive in determining its success. On November 3, 1903, Panamanian separatists declared independence from Colombia. The change came quickly. Colombian forces might otherwise have attempted to suppress the separation, but the United States deployed naval vessels near the isthmus. Their presence helped prevent Colombian troops from moving effectively against the new government. Harbor lights shone across the water, while American ships waited nearby. There was little uncertainty about the weight of their presence. Panama had its own separatist leaders, its own grievances, and its own reasons for seeking independence. Yet without intervention by the United States, events might have unfolded very differently. 3 days later, on November 6th, the United States formally recognized the Republic of Panama. Recognition gave the new republic an important measure of international standing. It also opened the way for canal negotiations under hurried and unequal conditions. The person who negotiated on Panama's behalf was Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French canal promoter. He had worked to preserve the value of the earlier French undertaking and strongly supported an American canal through Panama. Although he had been appointed as Panama's representative, he was not Panamanian. He negotiated in Washington before a Panamanian delegation could take a full part in the discussions. On November 18th, only 15 days after the Declaration of Independence, Bunau-Varilla and John Hay signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty. The speed of the negotiations, Bunau-Varilla's unusual role, and the sweeping terms of the agreement have remained deeply controversial. The treaty granted the United States the right to build, maintain, operate, protect, and control the canal. Around the planned waterway, it created a canal zone 10 miles wide, extending roughly 5 miles on either side of the route, with certain exceptions near Panama City and Cologne. Panama formally retained sovereignty over the zone. The United States did not legally own Panama, and it did not own the entire isthmus. Yet American authority within the canal zone was exceptionally broad. In many practical respects, the United States could act as though it were sovereign there. It could administer the territory, maintain order, construct public works, and exercise extensive control over land needed for the canal. This was not a treaty negotiated between equal powers. Panama was a new republic, only days old, and dependent upon American recognition and support. The United States was a much larger nation, with military strength, financial resources, and a firm determination to secure the canal route. The words on the treaty paper reflected that profound imbalance. In return for the canal rights, the United States agreed to pay Panama $10 million, followed later by an annual payment. Separately, the United States purchased the machinery, excavations, railway interests, buildings, maps, and other canal assets belonging to the French company. The two payments served different purposes. One concerned Panama's territorial and political concessions. The other transferred the remains of the unfinished French undertaking. Panamanians did not all interpret the new arrangement in the same way. Some welcomed independence and believed that the canal could support the economy of the young republic. New employment might sustain families, better ports, roads, water systems, and sanitation might benefit growing communities. Merchants anticipated greater trade, while workers came from Panama and many other places, bringing their languages, skills, and customs to the isthmus. These expectations were not without foundation. The canal project created employment and infrastructure. It strengthened Panama's place along international shipping routes and encouraged trade near the canal entrances. Public health programs reduced mosquito-borne disease in canal settlements and nearby urban areas. Roads, offices, workshops, warehouses, and communication lines began to appear along the route. Yet these benefits did not erase the authority Panama had surrendered. The canal zone divided Panamanian territory from one ocean to the other. It formed a broad corridor governed largely by another country. Communities were displaced as construction expanded, and later as waters rose. Unequal systems of pay and segregation shaped daily life. Workers were separated by race and nationality, while housing, services, and opportunities were distributed unevenly. For many Panamanians, the zone became a visible reminder that national independence had arrived together with a serious limitation upon national control. A person traveling through the Republic could encounter boundary signs, foreign officials, and regulations established outside Panama's own institutions. Over time, these conditions became a lasting source of resentment, protest, diplomatic disagreement, and conflict. The Canal Agreement therefore carried two histories side by side. One was a history of connection. It included ports opening toward global trade, wages earned by workers, streets and water systems improved, and a future waterway that would place Panama near the center of world commerce. The other was a history of unequal power. It included territory divided, communities displaced, segregation imposed, decisions made without equal representation, and sovereignty narrowed by a treaty signed under extraordinary pressure. Neither history can be understood fully without the other. The employment, infrastructure, trade, and sanitation improvements were real. So were the lost authority, the displacement, the unequal treatment, and the disputes that followed. Panama was neither absent nor passive in its own history, but the choices available to the new republic were shaped by the power of the United States. On May 4, 1904, the American Canal Project formally began. The United States took possession of the French company's canal assets, and a modest ceremony marked the transfer. There were no completed locks, and no open passage from sea to sea. Instead, officials inherited aging machinery, unfinished excavations, old buildings, railway property, maps, and a landscape that had already absorbed years of labor and loss. Administrators opened offices, engineers unfolded surveys across wide tables, and examined the work that had come before. Storehouses were counted, locomotives inspected, and camps prepared for the workforce that would soon arrive. Along roads and railway sidings, signs identified departments and districts. Telegraph wires linked ports, stations, and headquarters, carrying brief reports through the humid air. The political agreement now began to take a physical form. Boundary lines were drawn across maps and then marked upon the land. Roads entered places that had once been reached by narrow paths. Offices stood near harbors and railway tracks. Construction camps appeared beside forest and fields. Flags moved gently above administrative buildings, while clerks recorded supplies, property, wages, and arrivals. Across open ground and along the edges of the forest, surveyors pressed stakes into the earth. Some marked property lines, others indicated possible roads, building sites, reservoirs, and excavation boundaries. The posts looked small beside tall grasses and broad green leaves. They seemed quiet and temporary, yet they announced an immense change. For the moment they were only measured points in the landscape, standing beneath the sun and tropical rain. Soon these markings would become rail lines, dams, excavation cuts, and lock walls. They would form a vast stairway of water, designed to carry ships slowly across the continent. Chapter 8: Building a Stairway for Ships. The survey stakes standing among the grasses were soon joined by a much larger arrangement of human activity. Along the railway came timber, cement, steel, coal, food, tools, spare parts, and workers from many shores. Workshops sounded with measured hammering. Steam shovels waited beside exposed banks of earth. Locomotives moved through the humid air, drawing long lines of open cars behind them. When the United States assumed control of the canal project in 1904, it did not begin with an empty landscape. The earlier French effort had left excavations, machinery, buildings, surveys, railway assets, and a considerable store of engineering knowledge. Some equipment had deteriorated in the tropical climate, and some plans would be set aside. Yet much could still be studied, repaired, adapted, or put to use. The task was not simply to dig. Before excavation could proceed steadily, nearly everything supporting it had to be organized. John Frank Stevens gave close attention to this wider system. He improved the railway, expanded housing, arranged reliable supplies, and strengthened the transportation network, connecting work sites across the isthmus. Workers needed meals, clean water, medical care, tools, and shelter. Machines needed fuel, spare parts, and regular maintenance. Excavated rock and soil had to be carried away almost as soon as the steam shovels lifted it. Stevens understood that the railway was not a secondary convenience. It was one of the central instruments of construction. A steam shovel might bite into a bank and fill a waiting rail car, but unless a locomotive removed that car and brought another into its place, the shovel would soon have nowhere to put the earth. Digging depended upon movement, and movement depended upon careful timing. Tracks were shifted again and again as the shape of the excavation changed. Trains entered the work areas, collected broken rock and heavy clay, and carried the material to disposal grounds. Their specialized equipment helped move the tracks across fresh embankments. Earth removed from one place could sometimes be used elsewhere, supporting towns, breakwaters, and construction areas. Behind this steady motion lay a fundamental decision. Would the canal be dug all the way down to sea level, as the French project had intended, or would ships be raised above the oceans and carried across an elevated waterway? Stevens strongly supported the second plan, a lock canal. A sea-level canal appeared simpler in one sense, because ships would pass through without being lifted or lowered. In Panama, however, such a canal would have required much more excavation through the continental divide. It would also have left the builders facing the difficult Chagres River, whose flow could change greatly under tropical rain. The lock design did not try simply to remove or bypass the river. It used the river as part of the canal. Across the Chagres near Gatun, workers built an immense earth dam. Gatun Dam held back the river and created Gatun Lake, which spread across a broad portion of the canal route. Valleys filled with water, hilltops became islands. An inland lake gradually appeared where forests, fields, settlements, and winding river channels had been. The change was immense, and it carried a human as well as an engineering cost. Communities in the flooded area had to be relocated, and familiar landscapes disappeared beneath the rising water. Yet for ships, Gatun Lake would become an elevated navigation channel. Vessels could travel much of the way across Panama on the lake, rather than passing through a continuous trench cut deeply into the land. The canal could now be imagined as a stairway made of water. From the Caribbean side, a ship would enter the 3 stages of Gatun locks. Each stage would lift it higher until it reached the level of Gatun Lake. After crossing the lake and passing through the channel cut across the continental divide, the ship would begin its descent toward the Pacific. One step at Pedro Miguel locks would lower it first. Two more steps at Miraflores locks would carry it down towards sea level. The original lock chambers were approximately 1,000 feet long and 110 feet wide. They were vast concrete rooms, although from the deck of a large vessel, they could seem narrow and carefully fitted. At either end stood great miter gates. When closed, the two leaves of each gate met in a shallow V-shape. The pressure of the water helped push them more firmly together. The gates were hollow. Their buoyancy helped support their great weight and reduce the load upon their hinges. Like many parts of the canal, they joined massive size with a principle that was simple, practical, and quiet. The movement of water was simple in principle as well. Large culverts, or enclosed channels, ran through the lock walls and beneath the chamber floors. When valves opened, water flowed into or out of a chamber by gravity. It rose through openings beneath the floor, allowing the chamber to fill relatively evenly. Ordinary filling and emptying required no pumps. Water naturally moved from a higher level toward a lower one. To raise a ship, operators allowed water from above to enter the chamber. The vessel floated upward with the rising surface. To lower it, they released water toward the level below, and the vessel settled gently with it. The ship did not climb in the way a railway climbs a slope. It remained afloat. The water itself rose and fell, carrying the vessel as calmly as a leaf lifted by a deepening pool. Along the lock walls, electric locomotives traditionally known as mules helped keep vessels centered and under control. Steel towing lines connected the mules to a ship. Careful adjustments kept the hull from drifting against the concrete walls or the gates. Despite their familiar name, these locomotives did not normally propel ships across the entire canal. Ships generally moved under their own power, or with other assistance, while the mules guided and controlled them within the original locks. Their work was precise rather than hurried, a measured balance of tension, distance, and speed. While concrete walls rose at Gatun, Pedro Miguel, and Miraflores, another kind of labor continued through the high ground near the center of the isthmus. Here the canal had to pass through the continental divide, the ridge separating waters flowing toward the Caribbean from those flowing toward the Pacific. This passage was known as the Culebra Cut. It later became widely known as the Gallard Cut. Steam shovels stood on terraces carved into the slopes. Drilling crews prepared holes for explosives. Once broken material had been cleared, the shovels loaded it into rail cars, and trains carried it away. The excavation widened and deepened season after season, yet the hills did not always hold their shape. Layers of clay and fractured rock absorbed rain and shifted under changing pressure. Landslides moved into the cut, sometimes gradually and sometimes in larger flows. They buried tracks, damaged equipment, and filled areas that crews had already excavated. Some material had to be removed more than once. The work required patience rather than a single triumphant effort. Tracks were repaired, shovels were repositioned, drainage was improved where possible, surveyors measured the slopes again. Locomotives returned with empty cars, and excavation resumed. The railway remained essential. Spoil had to be removed continuously so that the steam shovels could continue working. If the train stopped, the excavation slowed. If a slide covered the tracks, crews first had to restore the route before the larger rhythm of digging and hauling could begin again. In 1907, George Washington Goethals became chief engineer. He remained in charge through completion, coordinating an organization that had grown into something like a long industrial city spread across the isthmus. Work sites, railway yards, offices, machine shops, settlements, hospitals, kitchens, warehouses, and ports all formed parts of one connected undertaking. Yet neither Goethals nor Stevens personally designed or built every part of the canal. No small group could have done so. The project depended upon tens of thousands of people and many different kinds of expertise. Engineers, mechanics, train crews, drillers, carpenters, masons, clerks, cooks, medical staff, sanitation workers, and laborers all contributed to the work. The recorded construction workforce reached a peak of nearly 40,000 in 1913, Official figures list more than 56,000 people employed, from 1904 through 1913. This total included more than 31,000 workers from the West Indies, nearly 12,000 from Europe, and about 11,000 from the United States. They brought different languages, customs, experiences, and skills. Many West Indian workers came from Barbados, while others arrived from islands and mainland communities throughout the Caribbean. European laborers came from several countries. Panamanians and other Latin Americans also contributed, though historical records did not always represent every worker with equal care. Nor were these workers treated equally. The canal administration maintained a divided labor system, often described as the gold roll and the silver roll. In general, white American employees received higher wages and better housing and services. Many black Caribbean workers were placed on the lower-paid silver roll. These divisions reflected race, nationality, and occupation, and they shaped ordinary life in neighborhoods, dining halls, pay lines, and workplaces. The canal's engineering achievements cannot be separated from this unequal world, nor can they be separated from loss. Public health had improved greatly since the French period, but construction remained dangerous. Accidents, disease, landslides, and demanding working conditions continued to take lives. Thousands died during the American-led construction years. A commonly cited official estimate records approximately 5,600 deaths, with West Indian workers bearing much of that loss. To remember them is to see the canal more fully. Its concrete walls and broad lake no longer seem to be the work of only a few well-known engineers. They become the result of countless individual days. There was the brakeman signaling beside a moving train. There was the cook preparing food before dawn, the carpenter repairing a roof after heavy rain, and the mechanic cleaning and fitting a worn machine part. There was the drill operator working against a wall of stone, the clerk recording shipments, and the survey assistant carrying instruments along a muddy slope. There were also the crews tending valves, laying rails, mixing concrete, clearing drainage channels, unloading ships, maintaining housing, and caring for the sick and injured. Each task belonged to a larger pattern. The canal emerged from all of them together. From 1904 to 1914, the landscape was steadily rearranged. Gatton Dam rose across the Chagres. Gatton Lake widened behind it. Concrete chambers took shape beside the new waterway. Gates were assembled and set upon their hinges. Culverts waited within the walls and beneath the lock floors. In the central hills, trains carried away load after load from the Culebra Cut. By the final years of construction, the separate parts were becoming one continuous system. River, dam, lake, locks, wearway, and excavated channel began to work as parts of a single design. The Chagres, once seen mainly as an obstacle, now supplied the elevated waterway. Gravity would fill and empty the chambers. The locks would lift ships and lower them again. Across Panama, the old dream of a passage between oceans was taking a distinct and practical form. It was not a simple channel at sea level. It was a carefully balanced landscape of water, earth, steel, concrete, labor, and gravity. A ship would enter low beside one ocean. It would rise step by step into the green interior, cross a broad lake among former hilltops, and pass through the divided land. Then it would descend, one chamber at a time, until it floated once more at sea level beside another ocean. After years of planning, digging, building, hauling, measuring, and patient repair, the stairway of water was nearly ready.